David retires at 55, believing he has done everything right. His retirement accounts look healthy, his expenses seem manageable, and after decades of working, he finally has something money was supposed to buy him all along: time. Then 30 days pass, and something happens that changes the way he sees his entire retirement. No paycheck arrives. David is still wealthy on paper, but wealth and income are not the same thing. For the first time in his adult life, he has to create his own paycheck month after month, year after year, without accidentally draining the money that may need to support him for decades. And that's where early retirement becomes a completely different financial game. From 55 onward, different accounts, benefits, healthcare decisions, taxes, and withdrawal rules can come into play at different times. So the real challenge isn't simply reaching a retirement number. It's answering one question before your final paycheck disappears. Where will every dollar you need actually come from for the next 10 years? Chapter 1. Your retirement is actually a timeline. Most people think retirement begins on one specific day. You finish your final shift, receive your last paycheck, and everything you've spent decades building suddenly becomes your retirement system. But for David, retiring at 55 reveals a very different reality. Retirement doesn't begin all at once. It unfolds in stages. At 55, David's salary stops immediately, but his financial life doesn't suddenly switch into retirement mode. He needs income for everyday expenses right now, while different accounts and benefits operate under different rules and timelines. Depending on his circumstances, certain workplace retirement plan provisions may help him access money earlier, while other options become available or change as he gets older. That means David shouldn't look at his retirement as one giant number sitting at the top of a spreadsheet. He needs to look at it as a timeline. What funds his life at 55? What changes around 59? Should Social Security become part of the plan when he's first eligible, or does waiting better fit his situation? What changes when Medicare eligibility arrives? This is where two people with the same $1 million can experience completely different retirements. One may have carefully positioned money to cover each stage. The other may have the same net worth, but discover that the money isn't available in the right place, at the right time, or without financial consequences they failed to anticipate. So David's first job in retirement isn't choosing where to travel. It's giving every stage of the next decade a funding source before he reaches it. Because once that timeline is visible, a more important problem appears. David doesn't need $1 million sitting on a statement. He needs to turn those assets into a reliable paycheck without accidentally weakening the future he's trying to protect. Chapter 2. Build your own retirement paycheck. For most of David's adult life, income was automatic. Every few weeks, a paycheck arrived, bills were paid, some money was invested, and life moved forward. Retirement reverses that system. Now David has to answer a question his employer used to answer for him. Where will next month's paycheck come from? The mistake would be to look at every account as one giant pile of money and withdraw wherever it seems easiest. Instead, David maps his expected annual spending against the resources available at different stages. Some expenses might initially be covered by cash reserves. Taxable investments may provide another source. Depending on his circumstances and plan rules, eligible workplace retirement funds could become part of the bridge. Even optional part-time income could reduce how much his portfolio must provide during the earliest years. The key idea is income sequencing. David isn't trying to find one account that funds his entire retirement. He is deciding which resources support each stage while considering taxes, investment conditions, and what needs to remain available later. Suppose David needs $70,000 a year to maintain his lifestyle. The important question is no longer simply whether his total portfolio can theoretically support that amount. He needs to know exactly where year one's $70,000 comes from, then year two's. Then, year five's without assuming every future benefit is already available today. Later, the equation changes again. Social Security may eventually become part of his income plan. Medicare can change the healthcare picture. Other retirement accounts may become easier to access under different rules. That is how a retirement portfolio becomes something far more useful. a planned series of paychecks. But David's first few years create a special challenge. Before some later milestones arrive, he needs to cross the earliest section of the bridge, and one retirement rule could give certain workers an option they didn't realize they had. Chapter 3, ages 55 to 59, the first bridge. For David, the first few years after leaving work may be the most carefully planned part of the entire journey. His paycheck is gone, later retirement milestones have not yet arrived, and his monthly expenses haven't disappeared simply because he stopped working. This is where the difference between having money and having money available at the right time becomes critical. Imagine David has $1.2 million in total assets. That sounds reassuring. But suppose most of it is inside retirement accounts and home equity, with only a modest amount in cash and taxable investments. Another retiree could have the exact same net worth, but hold more assets that are readily accessible. Same wealth on paper, completely different flexibility during these first years. This is why David needs to identify his bridge money before leaving his job. Depending on his situation, that could include cash reserves, taxable investments, income from part-time work if he chooses, or distributions from retirement accounts when the applicable rules allow them. The goal isn't to find one magical account. It's to coordinate these sources so one decision today doesn't unnecessarily limit tomorrow. For some workers, the rule of 55 may be one piece of that bridge. Generally, if someone separates from service during or after the calendar year, they turn 55. Distributions from that employer's qualifying workplace retirement plan may avoid the additional 10% early distribution tax that can otherwise apply before 59. But the details matter. The exception doesn't automatically apply to IRAs. Ordinary income taxes may still be due, and the employer plan itself may limit how distributions can be taken. That creates an important lesson. Where your retirement money sits can matter almost as much as how much you have. $1 million spread strategically across different account types can provide very different options, from $1 million concentrated somewhere difficult or costly to access at a particular stage. And David is about to discover why that flexibility matters. Because his bridge may look perfect when markets are calm, but what happens if stocks fall sharply in the very first year he needs them to fund his new paycheck? Chapter 4. What if the market falls during the bridge? Now imagine David's plan works perfectly for the first year. He knows he needs about $60,000 to fund his lifestyle, and he expects part of that money to come from his investment portfolio. Then, just months into retirement, the market falls sharply. David suddenly faces a decision that never appeared in his retirement spreadsheet. His bills still arrive on schedule, but selling investments now could mean turning temporary market losses into permanent withdrawals. He cannot simply tell the mortgage company, grocery store, or insurance provider to wait until the market recovers. This is where the real value of a retirement bridge becomes clear. If David's entire income plan depends on selling stocks every month, the market effectively controls when he sells. But if his plan includes appropriate cash reserves, other accessible assets, reliable income sources, or spending he can temporarily adjust, he may have more flexibility in deciding where that year's $60,000 comes from. For example, David might cover part of his essential expenses from cash already set aside, while temporarily reducing optional travel or major purchases. Depending on his personal circumstances, other available income sources could cover another portion. The point isn't that everyone should hold a specific amount of cash or follow one withdrawal formula. It's that a flexible plan gives you choices when markets stop cooperating. And those choices matter because early retirement may last 30 or even 40 years. David doesn't need to predict exactly when the next crash will happen. He needs a system that doesn't depend on markets rising every year just to pay his bills. But eventually, another income source enters David's timeline. Around age 62, Social Security may become available, and suddenly he faces a tempting choice. Take the money sooner and reduce pressure on his portfolio, or wait for a potentially larger monthly benefit later. Chapter 5. Age 62 creates a tempting decision. By the time David reaches 62, he has spent years creating his own retirement paycheck. Then a new option appears: Social Security. For the first time since leaving work, He may be able to add a predictable monthly benefit to his income instead of relying as heavily on the financial bridge he built at 55. The temptation is obvious. Claiming now could reduce the amount David needs to withdraw from his investments each year. If markets are struggling or his expenses are higher than expected, that monthly income could provide valuable breathing room. After 7 years of funding retirement himself, taking Social Security may feel like finally turning on an income stream he spent decades earning. But there is a trade-off. For someone whose full retirement age is later than 62, claiming at 62 generally means accepting a permanently lower monthly benefit than waiting until full retirement age. Delaying beyond full retirement age can increase the monthly benefit further, up to age 70 under current rules. So David isn't simply choosing between money now and money later. He is deciding how much of his future guaranteed monthly income he wants to exchange for support today. And there is no universal answer. David's health, expected longevity, marital and survivor considerations, other income, taxes, portfolio strength, and personal priorities can all change the calculation. Someone who genuinely needs income at 62 faces a different decision from someone whose bridge can comfortably continue for several more years. That leads to the question David really needs to answer. Is he claiming Social Security at 62 because it is the strongest choice for his long-term plan, or because the bridge he built at 55 is beginning to run out? Because only 3 years later, another major milestone can change his retirement budget again. At 65, Medicare enters the picture, and the financial equation David started with at 55 may suddenly look very different. Chapter 6. Age 65 changes the equation again. When David reaches 65, something important happens. The financial bridge he started building 10 years earlier doesn't disappear, but one of its biggest moving parts can change dramatically: healthcare. Before 65, David had to arrange health coverage without relying on Medicare, whether through an ACA marketplace plan, a spouse's employer coverage, or another option available to him. But around 65, most Americans become eligible for Medicare, creating a major transition point in the retirement timeline. Suddenly, the healthcare strategy David built at 55 needs to be redesigned rather than simply continued. But Medicare doesn't mean healthcare becomes free. David may still face premiums, deductibles, copays, prescription drug costs, supplemental coverage decisions, and expenses Medicare may not fully cover. His exact costs depend on the coverage he chooses and his circumstances. The important point is that the structure of the expense changes, which means his retirement paycheck may need to change with it. And something else may have changed during those 10 years. Perhaps David claimed Social Security at 62. Perhaps he chose to wait. His investment balance has moved with the markets. Inflation has changed his spending. And the $60,000 lifestyle he planned at 55 may cost noticeably more by 65. This is why a retirement budget should never be treated as a number you calculate once and then forget. David's plan at 55 was designed to cross the first bridge. At 65, he needs to recalculate using the reality he is living now, not the assumptions he made 10 years earlier. And this transition reveals something surprisingly useful. Those years between leaving work and activating more of the traditional retirement system aren't necessarily just a gap to survive. For some retirees, they may also create a valuable tax planning window that can begin closing as new sources of retirement income enter the picture. Chapter 7. The hidden tax window. For years, David thought of taxes as something retirement would automatically reduce. Stop earning a salary, pay less tax. Simple. But after leaving work, he discovers something more useful. The years between his final paycheck and later retirement income may create a temporary planning window that did not exist during his highest earning years. Suppose David's taxable income drops significantly after retiring at 55. Before Social Security begins, and before later required distributions from certain retirement accounts become relevant, he may have years when his taxable income is unusually low. Depending on his situation, that could create opportunities to deliberately withdraw some pre-tax retirement money or convert part of it to a Roth IRA while managing the tax impact. Why would David voluntarily create taxable income? because leaving every dollar untouched in tax-deferred accounts isn't automatically the best long-term strategy. Large balances may eventually produce taxable withdrawals later in retirement. A carefully planned Roth conversion today could mean paying tax on some money now in exchange for qualified tax-free withdrawals from the Roth later. But whether that makes sense depends heavily on David's current and expected future tax situation. And here's where the strategy becomes more complicated than simply fill a lower tax bracket. Before Medicare, increasing income can potentially affect eligibility for income-based ACA premium assistance. Later, income can influence how much of Social Security is taxable and may affect income-related Medicare premiums. State taxes and other individual circumstances can change the calculation as well. So David isn't trying to pay zero tax today. He's asking a much smarter question. When should I recognize income so that my lifetime tax picture, not just this year's tax bill, works more efficiently? For some retirees, these lower income years may be an opportunity. For others, aggressive conversions or withdrawals could create unintended costs. The value comes from planning each year, rather than automatically withdrawing from whichever account seems easiest. And now, David has almost completed his bridge. But before leaving work, he needs one final test. Can he identify exactly how the entire journey works before he gives up the paycheck that currently makes everything possible? Chapter 8. Build the bridge before you burn the boat. By now, David understands that retiring at 55 was never about reaching one magical number. He could have $800,000, $1 million, or considerably more, and still have an incomplete retirement plan if he cannot answer one basic question. How does that wealth become reliable income at every stage ahead? Before giving up his final paycheck, David needs to map the journey year by year. Where does year 1 spending money come from? What funds years 2 through 5? Which accounts are accessible? And what rules or taxes apply? How will he cover healthcare before Medicare? And when might Social Security fit into the plan? Most importantly, what changes if the market falls at exactly the wrong time? A strong bridge doesn't require David to predict the next 30 years perfectly. Life will change. Markets will surprise him. Tax rules may evolve, healthcare costs may move differently than expected, and his own priorities at 65 may look nothing like they did at 55. What he needs is a plan with enough flexibility to adapt when those assumptions change. That means retirement readiness isn't simply having more money. It's knowing what each part of your money is supposed to do. Cash may provide short-term flexibility. Investments may support long-term growth and income. Workplace retirement accounts may have specific access rules. Social Security can eventually become another income source. Each piece has a different job, and the timing matters. David's biggest mistake would have been quitting first and figuring all of this out later. Because once the paycheck stops, every financial decision carries more weight. So before you burn the boat and walk away from work, build the bridge first. Know how you'll fund the early years, where healthcare fits, how you'll respond to a bad market, and which decisions can wait until later. The goal isn't simply to retire at 55. It's to reach 65, 75, and beyond, without looking back and realizing that the freedom you bought at 55 came at a price your plan was never prepared to pay.